If you don't know who I am, I drew your badge. I've been drawing comics for a fairly long time. I happen to bring one of them, but I have some in my bag. I've drawn a bunch of different types of comics. They have some adventure comics and some comedy comics, some that are really cartoony and some that are much more realistic. But I actually I think I might be okay for this panel because I have a lot of, I approach comics very technically. So there's, I can at least tell you how I do. All artists, of course, are a little bit different, but the way I do comics is well, the way a lot of artists who write comics also do. The first thing I do when I'm actually trying to produce comics is I write them out in these little half-page size layouts, which I don't think I've drawn anyway. But all you do really is you take a piece of paper and fold it in half, create a little half-size sheet of paper, and draw a little box on it. And for me, if you can fit it on this, it'll actually fit on a comic page. And this is a good gauge, especially if you're doing all the art yourself, of how much dialogue you can put on a comic page. Because if you write out everything and it takes up this much space, that's too much. So, for me and Stan Sakai does Usagi Yojimbo, a lot of artists who write do this exact same thing. Now, if you can't do it, if you're not an artist, the best part about this is when you see ones that I've done, it tends to be a lot of just sort of eyes and expressions and a guy talking, and they really actually do look like this. They are stick figure comics. And if you're not really an artist, it'll still work for you, and you can still at least see how much dialogue you're putting on a page. Now, if you're somebody like Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen, Alan Moore is notorious for writing gigantic, he's just a writer. So he's not an artist, and so he writes these pages and pages of description and dialogue. And all of the artists who have ever worked with him, they go, well, we get these things and we read them, and then we just draw the parts we like. Because honestly, sometimes for like 3 panels, he's written 2 pages of script. And so it's like, well, we keep the dialogue for the most part, but that thing that he was talking about where there's a cab in the background and there's a guy in it, we drew the cab, we drew the guy, but then there's this big description of what he looks like and what he's wearing, and he's this big on the page, so you can't really, but that's Alan Moore. So, the way you produce comics, if you're doing your own comics, which I imagine most of you probably are, that's generally how you're going to start. You're either going to start with a script or you're going to start with some layouts. Now there's another, this is in the comics biz, there's 2 main sort of camps. There's the DC camp, and they're just called the DC way and the Marvel way, because DC works the traditional way that comics always work, where a writer produces a script, or a writer-artist produces a script with rough layouts, and then those go to the artist, and then the artist draws them, and then they put in the lettering and inking and stuff. In the Marvel way, in the 60s, Marvel developed a different method, and what they would do is, they would sit down with the artist and the writer, and they would work out what happens on a page. And then they would draw that out. And then the writer would come in after that and fit this particular dialogue into every panel. Which is a very different idea. It's like, well, that means that the story is mostly controlled by the artist, and the writer just has sort of input as to what everybody's reaction is. But that can also lead to some really interesting things, because if you're having trouble with a sequence and you don't know what exactly everyone should say, but you do know what they should be doing, you can work out generally the layouts and just leave space for the word balloons. And put it away. I can tell you a bunch about the production of comics, but generally you can just measure a page, blow it up about 150%. A lot of people draw on 8.5 by or 8.5 by 14, the legal size pages. A lot of web comics are drawn that size. And if you're drawing comic pages, the traditional way to draw comic pages is they're really big. They're 10 by 15 image area. So while your comic is only this big, the pages are actually this big, and that's why they look so shrunk down. But lately, they've been sort of matching up closer to size, so there's a lot of artists who draw closer to the actual size of the page. Okay, well, that's all really boring technical stuff. Does anybody have any questions about good comics? Yes.
As a writer that's at least tried to work in collaborate with artists and stuff like that, I mean, I've read up on any of the stuff from Scott McCloud, just talking about the subject. There's always like this kind of balance between writer and artist, because I can't draw at all. I mean, I've just kind of given up on that whole thing. But it's really opened me up to try and be able to dialogue more with artists, and at least some of the ones that I've talked to just said, well, if you want to do anything, you have to, all you're allowed to do is put like a rough dialogue and like some rough actions, and then we do the rest. And we're like, that kind of doesn't sound like collaboration at all.
That sounds like that sounds closer to the Marvel method, but if you want, if you want a lot of control, if you want a comic, it's kind of how these things are done. It's kind of how much control you want to give to each person. The Marvel method gives more control to the artist. And the DC method gives more control to the writer. And depending on how talented each of those guys is, you can lean one way or the other. If you have Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman writing your comics, then yeah, sure, give them control because they're really good at it. And if you have guys who aren't as great at it, but you have a lot of really great artists, you tend to lean more toward the Marvel method. Now, from a writer's standpoint, of course, as a writer, you want to have a lot of control over it.
Okay, I'd like to at least have some. Have some that I'm not just like a small bite.
I will tell you, speaking as an artist, all artists are flakes. And the other thing is that all artists believe they can write. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think it's because if you do a piece of art and somebody else does a piece of art, and one piece of art is really great and one piece of art is really bad, then you look at the really bad piece of art and you go, oh, well, that one's not as good as this one. But if you have somebody who's a really good writer and somebody who's a really bad writer, and they both type out a page of words, and you look at one and you look at the other, it's like, well, they both look pretty much the same. So, and so everybody, all artists believe they can write, and sometimes that's not quite the case. When you're doing the art when you're actually doing the art for comics, you take in a lot of consideration, because a lot of the things that you would do in text in a book is done in very much in sort of more abstracted ways. For instance, when you control time. It's like, in a book, it's really easy to describe how long something lasts. On a comic page, you're moving it visually, so you have to use different techniques in order to show the passage of time. And you can stretch and compress time using your layouts. And it's like, well, that's not a writing trick, that's an artistic trick. In particular, I don't know, maybe you should find a different artist. A lot of writers who aren't that great, a lot of writers who aren't great artists eventually, a lot of times, end up doing their art anyway, because you can do okay art and still get a pass for really good writing. Because really, when you do a comic, the art is the hook, but the writing is what carries the book. If you have really great art and your writing is not that great, then your really great art will probably carry you for a couple of issues, but really great writing will keep a book with kind of terrible art going for a long time, because people will give some credit for the art because the storyline is compelling.
So I mean, so at least as a follow-up question about what you just demonstrated in terms of the mapping method stuff. I mean, I know Neil Gaiman only does like sketches at best or something like that for his own things, but they're still pretty good. Is there anything that like you recommend for like folks that know that they're not going to be putting out really great artwork, but things that they can do to improve their artwork?
Well, there's people that artwork is really. I can't argue with Dave Sim and his. Dave Sim started out. He did Cerebus, which is one of the real epic works in comics, and he's a crazy man, but Cerebus is really a good piece of work, and he is really crazy. And he talks about he started out. He wasn't a great artist, but he was like, I want to do this book. I'm going to do 300 issues, which is a staggering commitment. 300 issues at 30 pages an issue, a lot of pages. And he finished it. It's like it took him 20 years, but he finished the entire thing. And most of it's really good. But he put out a set of issues where he talks where they were reprints, but he put in additional material from his notes and stuff that he was just going on when the reprints came out. And one of the things he talks about, I think it was around issue number 100. So already he's, 3,000 pages into this thing. And for his sketches and his dialogue and his scripts, he was just writing them on pieces of loose paper. Because some relative of his, I think, died, who had been in business in the 30s. And when he went over to the guy's house, the guy had a stack of paper. Blank sheets of paper that he had bought for a business venture of some kind. And it was this 6 foot tall stack of paper. And he was like, well, that's just what I'll use. It's like, I've got this giant stack of paper. And so he took this giant stack of paper, and whenever he was doing anything, he was just using, it's like, well, here's all my sketches, here's all my layouts, here's what I think this expression for this page should look like. And around issue number 100, because he's drawing the pages, the actual pages, separate from that. And around issue 100, 120, somewhere in there, he says, okay, I got to the bottom of this stack of paper. And by this point, Cerebus is one of the most critically acclaimed comics. It sells like gangbusters at that point in time. And he said, look, if you want to become an artist, I can't really recommend any method other than this. It's like he got a giant stack of paper and worked his way to the bottom of it. and there's an old adage in comics or in art where it says you have 10,000 bad drawings in you, and the sooner you get them out, the better. And so a lot of art, a lot of art is just practice. Certainly most of comics in production is just practice. If you go to my table, I have a little drawing of my little pony OC, and I always drew it as an earth pony, and it's like the reason for that is because there's no magic. It's like you sit down and do the work every day. That's actually how comics get done. It's like if you sit down, the comics, I've tried a lot of methods, but the only way I've gotten comics done is when I sit down and actually draw them. So if you want to become a better artist, like I said, if you look at all the people online, there are a lot of people who aren't great artists or who start out as, if you look at the early, like PvP, if you look at PvP, if you look at all the big webcomics, especially the ones that started in the 90s, it's like, yeah, a lot of them are terrible. They're written terribly, they're drawn abysmally. And it's like, well, what changed? It's like, what changed was they did them for 20 years, or 15 years. And it's like, suddenly, like magic, after only 12 years of working on it, they became good. It's like that old Monty Python sketch. It's like, would Albert Einstein have discovered the theory of relativity if by pure chance he hadn't been working on it for a decade? And so a lot of it is just, can you, actually sit down and complete this work? And if you're worried about I have a friend who, it just kills me because he's actually not a bad artist, but he has this real complex. And I sympathize with this because I look at the stuff that I do and it's like, I don't, most of the time I don't think it's anything special. But he has this incredible complex, and the real problem with it is that he thinks his art is so bad that he doesn't do it. He thinks that no one will want to see anything he does. And I found some of his stuff that I had scanned in for some other project on a hard drive the other day, and I flipped through it and I was like, this stuff is great. I had forgotten all about it. I had not even remembered that he did this little project. And it's like, it's really cute. It's what you'd call as an editor perfectly serviceable. But he's stopped believing. And that's actually a really big problem. It's a lot of, comics is a creative field. It runs in a large part on belief. And if you don't believe you can produce comics, then you don't. And if you do believe you can produce comics, you do, and then people read them. And so if you want to get better as an artist, you shouldn't, there are a lot of things that I worried about as an artist that I really shouldn't have. Like, well, it took me a while to figure out that my personal style, what will it be? And it's like, well, that's actually not something you pick. That's just something that grows out of what you do. And so, it's like, well, can I get people to publish this? Like, well, that's not even a concern now. The internet publishes everybody, and you can follow them that way. So, a lot of the things, about that used to be about breaking into the industry or getting published, it's like those things have kind of gone away. And you can now do all kinds of stuff. It's a little bit harder because there's so many more people doing that stuff. But if you want to do comics, you can do those comics. There's a guy whose comic I read online. His comic is called Two Kinds. And this was a guy, when he started out, his comic is in a lot of ways derivative. If you've read a lot of manga, you've seen all of these characters before. It's like, it's a girl, but she dresses up as a guy and passes off as a guy. It's like, wow, how would you ever come up with that idea? So, but it's, and it's this fantasy world, and there's this guy who, there's this evil organization that's trying to kill these people. It's like, wow, it's like a fountain of originality. But the point of it is that when he did the comic, his art was good, and it's appealing, and he got better. And the comic is charming, and it's well written, and he kept doing it year after year after year, week after week. He updates. He is just an Iron Man. Never misses an update, and so he just kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. And the real payoff for this was, one, a lot of people read his comic. Two, a lot of people liked his comic. It's like I said, even though I knew where he was getting all of the stuff he was using originally, I liked his comic. It was nice. And he finally was like, okay, I've got all of these colored pages. I'd love to put out a colored book. I'm going to go on Kickstarter and ask for, $10,000 to print my book. And he got this enormous pile of money. He blew Kickstarter's doors off. People, because after, 4 or 5 years of reading this comic, everybody was like, yeah, we'll totally give you money. And so, and again, it's like, this was not some magical formula. He did a bunch of colored pages, and they're not bad. There's a bunch of things he can't draw. It's like, he can't draw architecture. He's not that great at magic effects. He's pretty poor at backgrounds. He's not good at set decorating. But these are me looking at this in a technical sense and breaking down all the elements on his page. The truth is, his layouts are good. His story is interesting. And his characters are nice. You like reading about them. And so it's like, well, what's carrying this thing? It's like, well, if it's his art, it wouldn't have lasted for more than a couple, maybe 100 pages, and people would have given up on it. But because he's doing this, and it's nice, and people like reading it, it's like, yes, you can do that, and you can get better. Nobody starts out as a genius artist. Everybody grows into it. And one of my favorite things, I bought the big Alex Ross mythology book where it's all his DC paintings and stuff from Kingdom Come. It's like, this is a guy, he's a multiple Eisner winner, he is this brilliant painter. He did these seminal books that everybody read, that won every award in comics. And then he crossed over and he started doing, mainstream advertising, and he did the posters for the Oscars. It's like, this is a guy who is, it's like he is a real painter, he is the closest thing to a pop culture painting phenomenon you could possibly ask for. And they say that in this book, they're talking to him about art. And they're like, oh, well, what kind of art what kind of artist do you look at? And he goes, oh man, who I think is great? Bruce Timm, the guy who does Batman. It's like the guy who did the Batman animated. It's like, Bruce Timm, oh my gosh, he's so awesome. His art is so great. And it is, of course, it's like Bruce Timm, super cartoony, clean lines, these flat areas of black and white. And it's the complete polar opposite of Alex Ross. Like, okay, Alex Ross, he's won every award we can give him. He's made all of this money. Everybody loves his work. And what does he want? He wants, if only he could draw like this other guy. This other artist who doesn't draw anything at all like him. That guy is so cool and his stuff is so great. And so that's when I went, okay, this is apparently every artist. Every artist has that guy that's like, if I could draw like that guy, oh man, I would have it made. Oh my gosh, I would just have it. I would all over that. And so everybody does that. And so there's not really a metric for comparing. It's like, you need to just realize that it's like, your art is never really where you want it to be, because that's what keeps you improving. It's like the only artist, if you ever meet an artist who goes, man, my art is great, it's exactly where I want it to be, you will look at that guy's stuff and go, this artist is terrible. Because that's, every artist I've met who said that. I was at Comic-Con one year, and there was a guy doing portfolio reviews, and it was, I was just on one of the aisles looking at stuff, and this was years and years ago when you could actually move down. But there was a guy behind me doing portfolio reviews, and you just overhear people talking, and he's talking to some, it's these two guys talking, and the one's giving a portfolio review, and he says, I think you could, improve this area here. He's looking at the guy's face. Like, I think you improve this area here, and you kind of need to work on your inking, because your inking is kind of spotty, and I really, think that you could bring this page together a lot more. And the guy breaks in. The guy who's talking to me breaks in and goes, oh, well, I'm not going to really worry about that, because I think I've got the inking pretty much figured out. And I turn around and look, and the guy who's doing the portfolio review, I don't know who the guy's talking to, but the guy holding the pages doing the portfolio review is just looking at him. And it's William Stout, who at the time was one of the top inkers in the industry. Everyone was just in awe of his inking. And he stands there for a minute, and he looks at the guy who's perfectly serious, and he goes, well, I'm glad you figured it out, because I'm still working. It was like, wow. And that's the thing. It's like I know you're unsatisfied with your art, but so is everybody. Everybody who's any good. If you read any review, there's a series from I think it's Tomorrow's called Modern Masters, where they just take a guy who's a really great comic artist, and they give them a whole book to talk about their art. And they print a bunch of art from them. And every time you read one of those books, they have a section where it's like, here's the guys that I really like as artists. Here's the guys, when I was growing up, I read this artist who was a comic strip artist in Papers and Span. I read this guy who was this artist in newspapers in England. And all of these guys, they all go, man, that guy is so great. I don't know that I could ever measure up to him. And again, a lot of these guys are just these giants in the industry. It's like, my particular old artist that I like, it's like Alan Davis and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. And Jose Luis Garcia Lopez is a guy who's great for doing aliens. It's like almost all the aliens you see in comics are stolen from him because he's really good at them. And but if you go over into the Alan Davis is one of my favorite artists. He can draw almost anything. Except cats. He can't draw cats at all. every artist has that Achilles heel. You'll find that one thing that they can't draw. It might be walls. It might be an animal. It might be some artists never draw cars for a reason. Every artist has that thing that they just get to and they can. And he can draw all of this stuff. Floating castles in space. Knights in shining armor, spacecraft, monsters. He's brilliant at everything, but he can't draw cats. Every time a cat shows up, a panther, an alley cat, you can tell he spent like an entire day drawing that one cat. And he just you draw great horses and brilliant dogs, but you can't draw cats. Bruce Timm can't draw hyenas. If you look at the hyenas in Mad Love, they don't look like hyenas. They're terrible. And it's like, that's his weakness. Every artist has weakness. And so you can't let that weakness and that idea that you should be able to draw as good as someone else stop you from doing anything. That's the point where you will really start to decay. Yes?
I kind of have trouble drawing dragons and all that.
Yeah.
Really can't
Every artist has that. Every artist has something that they can't do. And you can work on it a long time. Sometimes you can get past it. And a lot of the time that's how you get good at something. If you really have something, if you go, I have to be able to draw horses. I really want to be able to draw it. And then you spend the time on it. And that's really the difference is, then you spend the time on it. And again, that's not magic, that's that you spend a bunch of time.
I have trouble doing comedy in my comic strips. I don't know what to write, and that sort of troubles me. I can't also draw cartoons. It's hard.
I will give you my comedy writing tip, which is that I have found, because I actually started doing a college strip a long time ago, and that's when I figured out that I didn't know what other people thought was funny. Because I would write something that I thought, it's like, oh man, this is great, this joke will kill, and I would go in the school paper.
And they kill you.
And nobody, the way you can tell comedy failed is that nobody remembers it. It's like, oh man, did you read my strip this week? It's like, yes? It's like, okay, that was not the impact that I hoped this would have. And then there was one week where I had this joke that is like, okay, I can't think of anything. I've written out my ideas, because you have a list of ideas like, oh, that's a good idea. You write it down in a sketchbook or something. And so I went back to the junk file. I was like, I guess I can do this joke about ordering burritos. It's a really stupid joke. It's not funny. I'll come up with something better next week. Because that's the other thing. It's like, always look ahead. It's like, this page is great, but you have more to do. It's like, there's another one after this. If you can do one panel good, go ahead and let it go, move on. And so I did this burrito joke, and I put it in the paper, and I was like, well, I guess I'll just do that next week. And people were like, oh my gosh, that burrito joke was the funniest thing you ever wrote. And I was like, okay, this is the point where I realized that I don't know what people think is funny. So to this day, I try and write stuff that I think is funny, and I can only give you this one tip. This is the one thing that I've found to be true. There are two pillars of comedy. One of them is truth, and one of them is cruelty. And all comedy springs from those things. So if you have something that's true, that can be funny. And if you have something that's cruel, that's probably funny too. But if you have something that's true and cruel, that's comedy gold. If it happened to you and it makes you cringe, that is true comedy. So, if you have trouble writing comedy, a lot of comedy though is pacing. So you're probably going to have to learn, layouts. And I tend to use the shotgun approach. where I throw a lot of jokes on a page really fast. Because usually something sticks. And also, the other great piece of advice is from Joel Robinson, the of Mystery Science Theater 3000. And they asked him, and it turned out when they talked to other comedians, this was something that everybody took to heart. They asked him when he was doing the show, do you ever, because a lot of the jokes are really obscure. They make literary references, they make Broadway references. You know, it's like, oh, if you know who Jacques Tati is, you'll get that joke. It's like, if you don't know who Jacques Tati is, just move on to the next one. But they asked him, when you wrote these jokes, did you ever worry that no one would get them? And Robinson sat there for a second and he said, no. He said, we always thought the right people would get them. And it was that freeing thing. It's like, I'm not going to worry if anyone but me thinks this is funny. Because, and a lot of the people who like my comics, as it turns out, they're people who like the same things that I like. And if you don't get any of the references that I make, if you don't get any of the comedy, then you don't read my comics. But if you do get all the references, and you do like the same things I do, then you do read my comics. So you will tend to accumulate a fandom of people who think the same stuff that you think is funny. So if you write comics to please yourself, and you think they're funny, they'll tend to be more funny. But truth and cruelty, you can't go wrong. Really, I'm serious. When I've done the stories that people like in something like Wildlifers, which was my funny animal comedy, high school comedy, the stories that people liked are the most are the ones where I changed the least. You know, it's like, yes, I actually was in that restaurant that was closing, and I said it was my friend Mike. I was the straight man. I was the one who turned to him and said, Mike, I think this place is closing, and they're gonna like make us leave soon. And Mike is the one who turned around and went, I don't want to leave. I want to be thrown out. Loud enough for the people at the counter to hear him. And so it's like, okay, everyone thinks that's funny. It's like, yeah, truth and cruelty. It's like, that happened. You've never seen half an hour past closing time. They've mopped they've cleaned every table. They've mopped the entire floor except for artists in the corner. And they're sitting there. That's when Mike yells this. So, try to write what you think is funny. And because I'm a structuralist, I've spent a lot of time taking people's pages and breaking them down and seeing how they made a joke funny. And some of the time, it's just the energy. If you read Evan Dorkin comics, they're funny, but they're funny because truth and cruelty. And he's also keeping it fast. That's another thing you can do in comedy is if you write enough jokes onto a page, some of them will stick. So you need to keep them moving really fast. Questions? Any more questions? You can do comics. This is possible. It is more possible now than ever.
You mentioned before, like, spacing. Like, I'm very, very new to actually, like, I do art pieces, but
okay.
I'm just starting to do, like, little comic strip pieces, right? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned before, like, spacing something out to extend how long it is. Can you go into that in more detail?
That is a lot of layout tricks. And when you're doing layout tricks, your rough layouts will help you a lot. You don't have to be like Adam Warren. Adam Warren's the guy who draws the comic in Power. He's insane. He's from the Kubert School, the actual comic book institution that you go to learn how to do comics professional. And he's really good, but I draw layouts like this. He draws layouts that if I drew them would be my finished pages. And those are his rough layouts.
Those are my rough layouts.
And then he draws them again to move the panels around slightly and fix the layouts a little bit and move all the figures. So then he draws them entirely again. And then when those are done, he's like, oh, at last, my layouts are complete. And then he sits down to draw the page in a much more elaborate, and every editor and other artist who finds out that he does this is like, well, those are his pencils, right? It's like, no, those are his rough layouts. The pencils are much cleaner than this, and 2 layouts further down, it's like, everyone thinks he's insane. There are editors we work with who are like, I don't know how he completes anything because he draws every comic 3 times, start to finish. And so his layouts are so good that he just sells those and people buy them at the price of comic pages. They're comic pages. But when you actually lay out pages like this, it's like you can actually learn a lot from looking at the artists and writers that you like and seeing exactly how they're moving stuff. If you look at Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai, this is a guy who has internalized all those Toshiro Mifune samurai movies. You know, it's like he is a huge Kurosawa fan, so all of his comics have these wide cinematic panels in them. And when he wants to slow down time, panel, panel, panel. All these wide, empty spaces, so you scan back and forth and go through the whole thing. And it slows down your reading. You know, there's nothing going on. There's these people standing there looking dramatic, and it's like he's dilating time. He's making it seem like there's this enormous moment by using this cinematic technique. You know, and whereas if you go and look at like Howard Chaykin pages, or to a degree Evan Dorkin pages, he has packed this enormous amount of sound effects and dialogue and action into these tiny panels that rattle across the page. And it's like, and that's to keep it going. Lots of story. There's a term in comics that's called panel to impact ratio. When you do giant pin-up panels or splash pages, where you do one figure and it's huge, or one big action scene of everybody fighting, those panels have a lot of impact, but they do no storytelling because they're just a moment. And so and on the other hand, if you do a lot of tiny panels, they don't have much graphic impact, they don't look like much. You can do like, what's his name, Keith Giffen, where it's 30 panels of reaction shots on a page. And you look at that and it's like, okay, there's a lot of storytelling you can fit into 30 panels, there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of stuff going on, but they don't have any visual impact. And in comics, what you want to do is you want to strike that balance where you tell as much story as you can, but you also have as much impact as you need. And so you tend to save up, artists tend to bank those big panels so that when they need a big action scene and a huge impact and a big establishing shot to let you know you're on the space station, it's like, okay, they spin that. And then they build up the capital again, doing a lot of smaller things. So that though you can learn by studying the layouts of people that are much better than you the way I do.
I'll do an also.
Any more questions? I don't know what time it is. Then I'm almost on time. I hope you guys have enjoyed this panel. If you have any other questions, I can answer some of them. Yes?
When I started drawing comics, I never really had an issue with my art. You know, it's kind of bad right now, page. But I found my biggest challenge in making the layouts was the angle of the shot. And that's always kept me actually drawing the panel. Because I've always been sitting there wondering what's the best angle for the shot to show like the most impact, the most emotion, the best mood.
Layouts are kind of a dicey thing. I'm kind of appalled by the incredibly low level of layouts in comics now. There are a lot of comics that are just sort of knocked out. I mean, there's comics coming out from big companies, big titles coming out from big companies where I look at them and I go, there were no layouts done for this. Because a lot of the time, and it's more of a problem at DC because it's an artist working off of a script that they're sticking to, and they're like, okay, a guy gets out of a car, I'm drawing a guy getting out of a car. Okay, and these two people are talking, so I'm drawing them standing there talking. And they don't put a lot of thought into it. And I'm a huge, like I said, I'm a structuralist. So for me, layouts are all about how to construct a page that you can actually manipulate a viewer with. And if you're not doing it because you're uncomfortable, with drawing figures from a particular angle, then you should just learn to draw those figures from a particular angle. But if you're having trouble with it just because you want it to look a particular way, you're probably going to have to figure out exactly how you want these pages to flow and what kind of comic you want them to look like. Because if you have, for instance, manga layouts are very different from American layouts because the comics are produced very different. You do 30 pages every 2 weeks, whereas in an American comic you do 28 pages every month, every 4 weeks. And so it's like, well, manga artists have a lot more space to fill. So you get a lot more bigger panels, you get the big fashion shots of the figures, and it's like, those are because they don't want to draw action and dialogue on every page, because they've got a lot of pages to do. So they tend to have much more leisurely layouts. Also, you're reading 30 pages a week instead of 30 pages every 2 weeks instead of 30 pages a month. So manga layouts, they look a particular way because of how people read them and how they're produced. And American layouts look a particular way because of how people read them and how they're produced. Personally, my favorite layout guy is Alan Davis because he can do layouts for a bunch of different styles because there are a lot of different styles of layouts. He's a British artist, so he can do continental style layouts. He can do newspaper style layouts. He can do Mighty Marvel style action layouts. And he can also do DC panel by panel layouts too, because he's worked for everybody. He's a genius. If you want to learn how to do action layouts, the comic I suggest is an Alan Davis comic called JLA the Nail.
JLA the Nail?
It's a Justice League comic, but his premise in doing this comic was comics have become too insider. You have to know all this stuff about comics in order to read them. They're too complex. They demand too much of a new reader. So I'm going to produce a comic, and this is a guy, if you look at Clandestine, where he does his most elaborate layouts, like, oh yeah, he can do Marvel layouts, and he can do different styles of Marvel layouts. It's like, here's his page of Doc Strange where he does Steve Ditko layouts. And here's his page, and so it's like, he does different layout tricks. But in JLA, he does the simplest, most effective layouts that he can do to show the action and tell the story without trying to rope you into a bunch of things that you only know if you read comics. So there's no thought balloons, there's no narration, and it's a great story and it's very effectively told. And he does a lot of layout tricks in it. But it's like, this is something where he boiled it down and it's like, he's like, you don't need narration, you don't need thought balloons. If you can't show it, why is it in your comic? And so he went, I'm going to tell this story, and I'm going to tell it straight up like an old comic without all this stuff. And he did, and he did a great job. So if you want to learn how to do layouts, between that and Clandestine, where he uses every trick in the book. The funniest thing about JLA the Nail is, if you look closely at it, he does a splash page for every character. There's a splash page for Wonder Woman, there's a splash page for Batman, there's a splash page for all the members of the Justice League. But if you look closely at them, he's drawn them each in the style of the artist that he likes the most who worked on that character. So his Flash page is a Carmine Infantino page with this weird stiff pose in the after images. His Batman page is a Neil Adams page with this extreme perspective and this cloud of bats going around him to fill out the layout. And his Aquaman page is this Jim Aparo page with this super big motion through it. And it's like, okay, the funniest part is actually that he got his inker to go along with him and ink them in the style of those comics. So his Green Lantern has this big page, has this big thick Dick Giordano ink lines on it, and his Neil Adams page has this real thin, feathery, sketchy inking all the way through it. And so it's like, this is a guy who is doing a lot of trickery in the comics, but that's what he needs to do, because you want to tell this story to your reader, and those things are important. So if you're having trouble doing things from a particular angle, I can talk to you a little more after this and give you just some basic tricks that I use to make my layouts a little more interesting. But there used to be a book called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, where they went through how to make your panels interesting. And if you can find an old copy of that, it came out in the early 80s. John Buscema was the artist for it. He's long dead now. But every artist has their own layout style. There's a lot of ways you can go with it, and they're all effective. I mean, one of the things they tell you is, well, you should never do layouts on just a grid. That's very bad to do them just on a 9-panel grid. Only some of the greatest Eisner Award-winning comics are done like that. Watchmen is done like that. Batman Mad Love is done like that. And it's like, oh, they're both Eisner winners for best comics. I can't really say that they did them wrong. So, a lot of it is about individual style, and that comes out when you've done the right work. Anybody else? Thank you for coming to the panel. I'm glad I got to come out.